Study Section 10. Power, Authority, and Legitimacy. Introduction. In political philosophy, the concept of power and authority are intimately linked together. In our everyday language, you associate the two concepts together, and this has seeped into social and philosophy. In this study session, you will learn about the notions of power, authority, and legitimacy, relationship between the concept of and concept of legitimate authority. Learning outcomes for study section 10. After you have studied this study section, you should be able to examine the notions of power, authority, and legitimacy. Discuss the Weber contribution of the notion of authority. Explain the concept of legitimate authority. Notions of power, authority, and legitimacy. In political philosophy, the concept of power and authority are intimately linked together. In our everyday language, you associate the two concepts together, and this has seeped into social and philosophy. Consequently, one of the fundamental problems of political philosophy is that of the nature of political power and political authority, of the nature of the de facto and of the de jure, and of their relationship with one another. This, of course, has been one of the most controversial and frequently discussed problems in the history of political philosophy of theory, especially since the time of James Burdon, who is generally to have broached the problem in connection with sovereignty and made a systematic and sustained attempt to delimit the two concepts. But Burdon and subsequent political philosophers never really succeeded to delimit the two concepts clearly, nor did they recognize the incessant link between the two of them. There are two errors to be avoided in discussing the two concepts. One is to avoid identifying the two concepts together, while other is to sever them from each other totally. The two concepts are so important in political philosophy because there is an interest in the concept of authority now. For the mere fact that some social theorists are lamenting the loss of authority in the modern age, they are of the view that there is an ellipse of authority in the modern age, and therefore these social theorists assert that the modern age is without authority as it was in the medieval period. You shall first examine the nature of power. In the Germanic language, such words as might and macht, and the Romance language, such words as power and pouvoir, have long been in use as designations for the phenomenal power. The wide spectrum of meanings conveyed by the words is understandable. Power. The word power is applied in divergent ways, not only in common parlance but also in the various fields of learning, such as mathematics, physics, law, philosophy, and theology. But the word power designates in general terms the ability to bring about something. It could also mean influence, but in the main, the word power denotes the cohesive method employed by those not entitled to our obedience. Unlike power, authority does not involve the cohesive method. Thus, the robber may accost one and coerce him to surrender his property. The robber has power, but he lacks authority. Authority is usually backed by laws which give the person exercising authority some form of legitimate power to carry out the function he is performing. It may be objected that the policeman arresting a criminal uses coercion, This may be true, but it does not mean that authority may be coercive. What it does shows is that the policeman has authority to act in a way which is legitimate, and this includes coercive power. Authority therefore implies force exercised or capable of being exercised with the general approval of those concerned. Most theorists who have treated the two concepts of authority and power have clearly distinguished them and have mostly emphasized that authority does not involve force or coercion as in the case of power. Authority, it is generally argued, does not imply force, and as such, it is an alternative to the concept of power, which relies mostly on force or coercion. Authority in the political sphere occurs when there is willing compliance and a power to command and enforce obedience. The power of an authority is based on the general recognition that those subject to the commanding authority do so because it is based on rules or well laid down regulations. There is therefore a clear demarcation between the concept of power and authority. In the former case, it is simply based on naked force, while in the latter case, it is ruled, governed, and therefore obedience to the authority is not simply to the personality concerned or premised on the use of force, but it is based on the acknowledgement of some rules which make obedience to the authority obligatory. Hence, authority carries with it some suggestion of legitimacy. It will be necessary at this point to clarify two important notions about authority which will make it possible to clearly understand the nature of authority. The two notions of authority are inauthority and authority. In the latter case, 1. The notion of being an authority connotes that the person in the garb of authority is an expert in his chosen field. Hence, the notion of legitimacy may be involved since the person concerned knows what he is talking about in his field and he can legitimately make statements or talk about his field with the conviction of an authority and expects to be believed or his statements respected. This notion of authority implies power, but it is a sort of legitimate power. 2. The notion of being in authority implies that the authoritative person has a right of obedience from those concerned in view of the fact that it is based on some rules or regulations, and these rules and regulations confer some sort of power on the person issuing command. This form of authority is impersonal and it is unlike the first concept of being an authority. The two cases of authority, though different in nature, can involve each other. In a sense, if an authority can sufficiently muster its influence in the society, it can turn this into inauthority. However, there is a clear difference between the two cases of authority. The case of being an authority involves production of knowledge, but in the two cases, obeying the authority is premised on the authority given reasons. It is not just a blind compliance to the authority's command. Carl Friedrich has noted that being high authority involves giving good reasons for any action taken in the public sphere, but in the last analysis, the reasons have to be in consonance with the rules and regulations guiding the public sphere, and it is this fact that gives the actions legitimacy in the public sphere. Weber's contribution of the notion of authority. The notable contribution of Weber to our understanding of the notion of authority could help to illuminate the differences between power and authority. Although Weber was concerned mainly with the notion of authority, the explication he made of the concept could help in bringing out the relationship that exists between power and authority on one hand, and on the other hand, the relationships these two concepts have with legitimacy. Weber trifurcates the concept of authority: their traditional authority, charismatic authority, and rational legal authority. In this case of the traditional authority, the authority is simply based on the tradition, customs, and norms of the society concerned. In this case of authority, the authoritative command that is issued is respected simply because of tradition, customs, etc., and the authority is not premised on rules or regulations. In other words, it is no rule governed in the real sense of the word. It is simply like Tony's Gemeinschaft society. The charismatic authority is based on the achievement of an outstanding personality in the society. It is closely related to being an authority, but the major factor is that the charismatic authority is related to the personality concerned and not to its knowledge. The charismatic personality has authority either because of his outstanding achievements or because she has some grace attributed to the divine. Someone like Nkrumah, Kennedy, and Jesus were charismatic leaders. The last is the legal rational authority, which is based on rules and regulations. It is an impersonal form of authority. Its continuity is guaranteed because it is based not on a personality for its operation, for it is simply rule governed. Hence, there is obedience to this form of authority simply because there are rules and regulations governing it. The legal rational authority derives its legitimacy from the fact that it is predicated on rules and it is not based on force or coercion. Weber's threefold classification has the distinction of showing that certain aspects of authority are not based on force and that their legitimacy derives from certain sources which I have alluded to. But he argues that it is the legal rational form of authority that is best because it is based on the legal system, hence its rationality. He advocates that the other forms of authority be made routinized or regularized along the line of rational legal authority because they could degenerate and become simply based on coercion or force and hence could become illegitimate. Let us at this juncture pause and examine two concepts of authority. Distinction between de facto and de jure authority. There is a distinction that is usually made between de facto authority and de jure authority. It is contended by some social theorists that de facto authority cannot exist without de jure authority. It is further argued that de facto authority is simply based on force or coercion, while de jure is premised on rules and regulation. The mere existence of de facto authority shows that the authority no longer controls the situation and that the obedience of the citizens is got through brute force rather than by willing compliance based on some obligations to obey the authority because it is based on rules of this legal system. However, what has been noted is that a firm demarcation cannot be drawn between de jure authority and de facto authority, as some social theories have averred. Any form of authority has to be socially recognized, and the social recognition is brought about through socially recognized rules and regulations that are essential for the obedience of the citizens. In the de facto authority, it is force or coercion that the authority exercises, but this force issues out of the legal regulations or rules in most cases. In other words, it is not a naked force or coercion. It has to be mentioned that if it is only de facto authority that exists in the social system or state, then that authority is based, if it is not as well conjoined with de jure authority on naked force or power. It could therefore be inferred that de facto authority is naked power if de jure authority does not exist along with it. And to the extent that this is the case, authority is not a legitimate authority. From what has been discussed so far, there is a link between authority and legitimacy, and this relationship affects the concept of power. The point is that authority has to do with rules in the system, and these rules confer legitimacy on the authority in that system. Legitimacy of authority. The legitimacy of authority therefore depends on the legal system, and this legal system spells out properly the line which the authority has to follow. In other words, any authority has to be instituted along the line enacted by the legal system, and it is this legal system that confers legitimacy on the authority. This legal system could be, using Art's notion, patterned on primary and secondary rules. The primary rules are those that state what are acceptable and what are not in the society, or what the society requires or the citizens. The secondary rules are those that give the primary rules their basic foundation, in that they govern the primary rules and give them their rule of recognition. This is to say that the primary rules issuing from certain sources, custom, norms, contracting parties, courts, etc., are binding on the citizens. The secondary rules are essentially there to give the primary rules some sort of binding recognition in the society. This discussion so far has shown clearly that authority and power are not necessarily the same. Authority is rule-governed, while power is naked force, and if this is the case, power is diametrically opposed to legitimacy, because legitimacy presupposes that an authority should be based on some rules which confer it with legitimacy. However, it must be noted that authority has to be backed by force if it is to be effective, or put differently, there should be a fair guarantee of power to effectively function in the society. So, in some sense, power is necessary for effective authority. However, authority cannot be based on power per se, for if this occurs, then that authority is not legitimate. There is a point that has to be clarified with the last statement. The notions of authority and legitimacy have nominative dimensions, in that if an authority is a legitimate body, the sovereign body or authority has to be predicated on rules, and these rules confer legitimacy on the body. The sovereign body cannot just employ power or force all the time, but again, our obedience to the state or the sovereign body or the authority is habitual. It is not a matter you think about, yet this does not distract from the fact that you obey a sovereign body or authority because it is based on rules. There is a truth in the point that a government or authority that is rule-based derives its legitimacy from this fact, but it could be contested or argued that this is not all that matters. The most important thing is that a government or authority can be said to be legitimate in the proper sense of the word if it provides certain basic needs for the people. The rule-based grant of legitimacy of an authority is chimera if the basic needs of the people are not catered for. In the final analysis, the legitimacy of any authority revolves around how these needs are catered for. Even in the so-called democratic society, the main issue is simply how the government can cater for the needs of the society generally. In conclusion, you have gone through the entire topic from state to sovereignty, to power, authority, and legitimacy. These are kindred concepts and therefore be divorced from each other. But the upshot of our discussion is that the notion of power or force as a defining characteristic of state, sovereignty, and authority cannot be defended. You observed also that if power or force is the defining characteristic of these concepts, then the legitimacy of the sovereign body or authority is in doubt. I have not attempted to locate where sovereignty lies in the final analysis, but from the discussion, it might seem that the rule-governed system, or properly put, the legal system, is favored. But again, a qualification was made that the legitimacy of any authority in the last analysis depends on how it caters for the people's basic needs. Summary for study section 10. In this study section 10, you have learned that 1. In political philosophy, the concept of power and authority are intimately linked together. In our everyday language, you associate the two concepts together, and these are seeped into social and philosophy. 2. Consequently, one of the fundamental problems of political philosophy is that of the nature of political power and political authority, of the nature of the de facto and of the de jure, and of their relationship with one another. 3. The word power designates in general terms the ability to bring about something. It could also mean influence, but in the main, the word power denotes the coercive method employed by those not entitled to our obedience. 4. Authority in the political sphere occurs when there is willing compliance and a power to command and enforce obedience. 5. The legitimacy of authority therefore depends on the legal system, and this legal system spells out properly the line which the authority has to follow. In other words, any authority has to be instituted along the line enacted by the legal system, and it is this legal system that confers legitimacy on the authority. This is the end of study section 10. Thanks for listening.